This is Comcast Local Edition. I'm Jack Hansen. We're aboard the USS Hornet here in Alameda. It's a floating museum. We're celebrating 35 years since the Apollo astronauts went to the moon and back. John Stonesifer is with us. He is the person who is in charge of taking care of those astronauts. Everyone thought they were bringing back moon germs, and they really weren't. Nice to see you, John.
Thank you. Thank you.
Tell us what your job was and how it worked.
Well, the country's agencies thought that we might find harmful pathogens on the moon. So how do you protect the Earth's environment, the oceans, the rivers, the seas, the crops? How do you protect them if this is possible, if they do bring harmful pathogens back? So my job was to determine and develop the procedures for protecting the Earth's environment for this possibility. NASA was reluctant to do it. We knew that it would be difficult. We knew that it would be hard to develop the procedures and the technique. We had no choice. As one scientist once said, you know, the results could be so catastrophic that we cannot fail to take that risk. We have to do everything that's humanly possible.
This was a real fear that they had.
It was a real fear, yes. And we were directed to do all that we could to protect the Earth's atmosphere.
Yeah. When the astronauts were taken out of the capsule and brought back to the MQF,
right? Mobile quarantine facility,
right,
yes.
And they were put into that. They stayed in there how many days?
Well, they stayed in the MQF until we got to Hawaii, and then we transferred the MQF from the ship to an aircraft, flew them to Houston, still in the MQF, with all the systems working, protecting everything, you know, no harmful pathogens getting out of the MQF.
Right.
We then interfaced the MQF with what we called at NASA the Lunar Receiving Laboratory. So about 4.5 days, steaming time and aircraft time. Then we put them into the Lunar Receiving Lab, where they stayed for the remainder of the 21-day quarantine period.
We've all seen pictures of them coming out with those suits on.
Yes.
With the mask, looks like a gas mask kind of effect. Right. And going in that, they stayed in those until they got into the MQF, right?
Yes,
then they took those off. President Nixon came down. We see Nixon waving to the guys and speaking to them over the microphone. What was going through your mind at this point? Were you thinking, I hope they don't have, they're not carrying anything back from the moon, or what?
Well, my job was very interesting at that time, since I was in charge of the quarantine episode, and I was in communications with the helicopters to learn whether anything was going wrong out there. We put the astronauts into the biological garments with the filter that filtered the air that they were breathing out, so that they were not breathing out anything. The garments protected the bodies from giving off any harmful pathogens. We got them to the ship, and it's interesting that the president did not come down to greet them until they were safely into the mobile quarantine facility.
President Nixon was not taking any chances.
We were worried, and one of the directions that I had before I came out here, that if we have a major break in the isolation, this ship would have to remain at sea for 21 days.
With President Nixon.
With President Nixon. So, therefore, the communications were set up such that I would learn all along the way what was happening, that it was successful, and if anything did happen, I would salute the Secret Service man. He would immediately whisk the president and his groups to the deck where the helicopter was waiting and get them off of here before we broke quarantine or isolation.
It was like a secret signal, like a secret handshake or something.
That's right. I would salute.
Yeah.
That was a signal.
Yeah.
I was watching the engineer in the MQF. He was reading the gauges, making sure that everything performed properly. That was it. Thank you very much.
That story.
Oh, it's great to be here and participate in this ceremony.
You bet. That's Comcast Local Edition. I'm Jack Hansen aboard the USS Hornet. Thanks for watching. This is Comcast Local Edition. I'm Jack Hansen. We're aboard the USS Hornet here in Alameda. It's a floating museum. If you have the opportunity to come over here sometime, bring the family. You're going to have a great time. This week they're celebrating the 35th anniversary of the splashdown of Apollo 11, a fantastic event in the history of the United States and in the world, as a matter of fact. And John Stonesifer is with us right now. He was in charge, chief of Apollo 11 quarantine procedures.
Yes.
That's a hell of a job you had there. Well, now tell me about the fact when you were getting ready to do this and bringing the astronauts down, President Nixon came on the ship, right?
Right.
You had to meet the president.
Yes.
What happened?
Yes. Well, of course, the president came on the ship a few hours prior to recovery. We worked most of the night doing, it's like a final rehearsal.
Right.
And I guess we went to bed about 2 in the morning, and about 5 o'clock in the morning, the president came down. The admiral brought the president down and some of his staff for me to brief the president and Admiral McCain on the procedures that we would use. What would they look for and what would they see during this time when the astronauts would be in the MQF, the mobile quarantine facility. So I had the great privilege of briefing them on our procedures, what would happen. And I told the president, President Nixon, that 2 NASA employees, one a physician and one an engineer, had volunteered to enter the quarantine period with the astronauts, the physician to do the medical exams and the engineer to make sure all the systems work. And I said, they're volunteered to do this. He put his hands on his hips like this and said, when I was in the Navy, I never volunteered for a thing.
That's President Nixon, there you go.
I'll remember that all the time.
I'll bet. What an experience for you, though. Tell me about what was going through your mind at that point. Meeting the president, being involved with the Apollo 11 program. It must have been the high point of your life in one way.
Oh, yes, it was. A very, very historic moment, a historic event. But as most people that go through these kinds of things always realize, it really didn't sink in. I was so concerned about doing the job and having everybody else do the job to perfection because of the great risk involved, that it really didn't sink in probably until we were on our way home with the astronauts. And then the great moment was when we arrived in Houston and the astronauts' wives come out to meet them, still in the MQF, but the astronauts on the wives talking with the astronauts.
Looking through that window in the back.
Through that window,
and waving and all that
stuff. And that touched me also at that moment.
Yeah, I think you're right. That occasion was so historic and so emotional and so fraught with danger that when you're going through it, something shuts down in the human mechanism that allows you to control your emotions that will come out later on.
And that's very well put, because that's really what happened.
Yeah, and when you look back on it now, what do you think about it?
Well,
does it seem like it really happened?
Well, it did. It was a glorious event, and in a moment like this, the celebration, the 35th anniversary, seeing the old friends, and the dedication that everybody put into this effort, that's so heartwarming.
Yeah, it is kind of a strange thing that we accomplished so much to go to the moon. It's been 35 years.
Yes.
And nothing's happened since in that sense. I mean, space exploration of like the Cassini rocket and so forth, they have advanced that technologically. But as far as human beings moving out, it hasn't happened. Why do you think that is?
Well, first, costs. And one of the challenges we had was to do more research in space. And to do research in space where you repeat experiments over and over and over, you need a laboratory. Just like on the ground, if you're going to do research, you need a laboratory. And that's what Space Station provides for us, a laboratory to do research in space. So we're concentrating on that right now, and they're working on future programs, perhaps go back to the moon, perhaps go on to Mars.
Yeah. And the Mars program, would you like to be working on that? And be Mr. Head of Quarantine at that
I hope
point?
I'm around that. They'll do the same thing when they come back from Mars because of the unknown.
Right.
And they probably will do a quarantine in a space station before they get back to Earth to make sure that they're not bringing anything back to Earth. It might be a safer way of doing it.
Little green men, something like that.
Little green men.
That's right. John, it's a pleasure meeting you.
Thank you.
It's Comcast Local Edition. I'm Jack Hansen aboard the USS Hornet. Thanks for watching.